The sky had a worn-out look that morning, like old canvas stretched too thin across a frame. Dust rose in soft clouds as wagon wheels creaked down the main road, the wood groaning beneath the weight of trade and heat. In that small, tired town, folks moved slow, as if they feared waking something buried beneath the earth. And yet, all eyes were drawn to the girl who stood barefoot beside a weathered post, the hem of her dress stained the color of dried blood and old earth. She was a large woman, round in the hips and arms, with a frame that might have been called strong in another life, in another kind of story. But here, they didn't see strength. They saw inconvenience. Her shoulders were rounded from years of bending to burdens not her own, her hands calloused from work no one thanked her for. And behind her eyes, wide, dark, and quiet, was a history written in silence. Her father stood a few paces away, leaning against a crate with one boot cocked up like a man resting after hard labor, though the only thing he'd broken a sweat doing in years was belching or bragging. 50, and twice the bitterness of a man his age. His face was leathery from drink and sun, and his eyes, small, sharp, and forever half-lidded, scanned the street with the smugness of a seller certain he had a fool's bargain ready. Tied around the young woman's neck was a strip of tattered muslin with 4 words scrawled in black ink, $4 or best offer. The townsfolk didn't question it. They looked, they whispered, they moved on. The preacher turned his head. The general store woman shook her apron clean and didn't make eye contact. Only a child stared too long, and even he was pulled away by a tight-lipped mother. "She's healthy," the father muttered to a nearby man, who was chewing tobacco and trying not to laugh. "Sturdy as they come. Ain't no reason she should sit on my food supply with no ring on her hand. Done carry in, dead weight." The girl didn't flinch. She didn't move at all, really. She had perfected stillness years ago, learned how to make herself invisible in plain view. Her name wasn't called, her opinions weren't asked. When her father snapped his fingers, she obeyed. When he barked, she moved. And now, standing under the thick sun with sweat gathering at the nape of her neck, she waited to be handed off like a wheelbarrow or rusted anvil. She had never been kissed. Never been told she was pretty. She wasn't sure she believed in kindness anymore, not from men. But sometimes, in the lonely hours when the lantern burned low and her father's snores rumbled through the walls, she'd remember the way her mother used to hum when brushing her hair. That memory floated up like the scent of rain long gone, brief and aching. "You gonna take her, Jed?" the father asked a man with tobacco stains on his teeth. $4. Jed spat. "I'd rather pay 5 for a goat." Laughter. Shrill. Mean. Behind the circle of voices and jeers, standing apart in the shade near the blacksmith's awning, a man leaned on a post with one hand curled around a mug of cold coffee. Wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but the wind shifted just enough to show his jaw, strong, quiet, still. He looked at her like a man watching a storm roll in. Not afraid. Just seeing it. He didn't speak. Didn't interfere. But his eyes didn't leave her. The sun climbed higher. Heat rippled off the dirt. The girl's legs ached, but she didn't sit. She wouldn't give her father the satisfaction of sagging like a broken stool. No one made an offer. Not that day. Still, he kept her standing there, sweating and humiliated, until the sun sank low and her lips were cracked from thirst. Later, back at their crooked little home, he slapped her hard across the mouth. "For embarrassing me," he said. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. That night she slept on the floor, a thin blanket the only shield between her and the hard boards. Mice rustled near the cupboard. The moon cast faint light through the window and painted her round face in silver. She held one hand to her cheek, and for a long time, she simply stared at the ceiling. In the quiet, she remembered a story her mother used to whisper when she was small, something about a girl who wandered into the woods and found a deer with golden antlers. She tried to hold on to the words, but they slipped through like water through fingers. She didn't sleep. The next morning came with wind. Hot, restless, bone-dry. Her father was already yelling before the rooster called, cursing about money and mouths to feed. Said something about her eating him into debt and that she'd be sold by sundown, if it took all day. She peeled potatoes without a word. At noon, they were back in town. This time, he brought rope. Not to tie her, not yet. But he said it made the sale look more serious. Her feet burned on the hot dirt. The muslin sign returned around her neck. A new crowd. Same laughter. A man offered $3 and a bottle of whiskey. Her father spat at his boots. Another offered to trade a chicken and a dented pan. No deal. Hours passed. She stood still. Her lips were chapped. Her knees ached. Her eyes locked on nothing. From across the street, the same man leaned against the post again. This time he was eating something out of a paper wrap, maybe cornbread. When her father shouted at someone who laughed too loud, the man's gaze flicked over, but not in alarm. Just observation. And then, finally, a man in a wide coat approached. Peddler type. Greasy beard, yellow eyes, breath like rot. He jingled coins in one hand, said he had $4, and that he'd take the creature off your hands. Her father grinned. Deal done. The girl was passed over like a parcel. The coins clinked into her father's hand, and that was the last time she ever saw him smile. The peddler led her toward his wagon, muttering about hard labor and appetite. She climbed in without protest. As they rode out, she looked back once, just once. The widower was still standing at the post. But this time, his arms were crossed. Watching. Not smiling. Not saving. But seeing. That night, the wagon stopped near a dried-up creek. The peddler built a fire and tied a rope around her waist, loose, more show than safety. Said something about not liking runners. She sat beside a dead mesquite tree. Her wrists rested in her lap, palms open to the wind. The stars above burned fierce and cold. For the first time in years, she whispered aloud. Not a prayer. Just a name. Her own. She spoke it like a secret no one had earned the right to hear. And then she waited. For morning. For something. For someone who might finally say it back. And in the distance, downwind, unseen by her but listening to the crackle of fire and the breathing of earth, a horse shifted quietly under the weight of a rider who had followed without reason, watched without permission, and was now closer than the stars. The fire had died sometime before dawn. All that remained were soft red coals buried beneath a thin veil of ash, like old anger cooling into something quieter. She hadn't slept. Her back ached from the cold-packed dirt, her limbs stiff from stillness. The rope tied to her waist wasn't tight, but it marked a truth she'd long known. No man needs a noose when the soul is already tethered. The peddler woke with a grunt and a spit, scratching his beard as though fleas were hatching under his skin. He didn't speak to her, just tossed a stale biscuit her way and muttered about getting on the trail before the sun got too bossy. She didn't eat. Hunger wasn't new. Neither was the hollow that lived just under her ribs, the one that had nothing to do with food. They traveled in silence. Dust rose from the wheels, settled in her throat, clung to her lashes. The world stretched wide and dry around them, open but not free. She sat in the back of the wagon, skirts bunched under her legs, arms folded over her belly like a shield. The peddler kept glancing at her through the side of his eye, not shy, not bold, just measuring. As if trying to figure how much use he could get from the $4 he'd spent. At mid-morning, they passed through a dry gulch where a handful of prickly shrubs grew sideways from the rocks. He stopped to water the mule and relieve himself behind a boulder. When he came back, he looked different, not in the face, but in the air around him. Something had shifted. A decision had been made. She felt it before he said a word. He climbed into the wagon bed, slow and whistling, like a man reaching for a tool. She froze, instinct sharpening her breath. Girl, he said, ain't no sense in givin' me trouble. I paid for you fair. $4 cash, no haggling. That means you're mine to use how I see fit. She didn't speak. Didn't blink. He leaned in. His hand brushed her arm. And that's when she moved, not out of thought but out of something deeper, older, wild as wind in the bones. Her elbow found his throat before her mind caught up. He coughed, stumbled, cursed, grabbed for her. She kicked. Hard. His balance shifted. The wagon lurched. He fell backward off the edge, landing flat with a grunt and a thud. She didn't wait. She leapt. Feet hit dirt. She ran. The rope still trailed behind her, loose now, dragging like a broken leash. She tore through sagebrush and gravel, lungs burning, heart slamming like it wanted out. Her dress snagged, tore. Blood welled in a line along her shin. Behind her, the peddler's curses bounced off rock, but he wasn't fast. Not anymore. She didn't know where she was running. Only that her legs had finally remembered how. The ground dipped suddenly into a narrow ravine. She slid down the slope, half falling, hands grabbing at scrub and dry root. When she landed, breathless and shaking, she crawled beneath a gnarled tree that leaned sideways like it too had grown weary from the sun. And then she sat. 4 hours maybe. Time stretched thin, pulsing with the sound of her own blood. She pressed her back to the roots and held still. The peddler's voice faded. The wind returned. Silence settled. Birds circled above. A lizard darted across her foot and disappeared. She waited. No one came. And that was both comfort and ache. By dusk, her limbs were trembling again. Not from fear this time, but from exhaustion and thirst. She stood, knees buckling slightly, and turned toward nowhere in particular. That's when she saw the rider. Just a dark shape at first, on the ridge above. Still as stone. Horse and man cut sharp against the fading sky. She couldn't see his face. Didn't need to. It was him. The one from the post. The watcher. He didn't gallop down, didn't call out. Just guided the horse along a slow, sloping path until he was near. 20 feet, maybe. Far enough not to crowd her. Close enough to offer choice. She backed against the tree, but only out of habit. He made no move toward her. He dismounted, slow and sure. Unhooked a canteen from the saddle and set it on a nearby rock. Then he spoke, for the first time. You can run farther, if you want, he said, voice low, calm, almost tired. But you look like you're done running. She didn't reply. He pointed at the canteen. That's yours. Take it or don't. She didn't move. He nodded once, like he'd expected as much, then turned and walked the horse a few paces away, loosening the reins so it could graze. She watched him for a long time, chest still heaving in slow, rattled pulls. Then, inch by inch, she crept forward. Took the canteen. Unscrewed the top. Smelled it first. Water. Cool. Clean. She drank like it was prayer. When she looked up, he was sitting on a stone, arms resting on his knees. Not staring. Not even speaking. Just, waiting. After a while, she sank to the ground again. Not close. Not far. The rope still hung around her waist. You ain't gonna ask what happened, she said, her voice hoarse. He shook his head. Already saw enough. They sat in silence until the first stars blinked through the veil of twilight. Eventually, he spoke again. There's a cabin about half a day west. It's quiet. Safe. My daughter's there. She's little, but she won't mind company. Got food. Blankets. Ain't much, but it's warm. She stared at him. Not in fear. In disbelief. You want me to work for you? She asked. No. You want me to stay with you? Her voice cracked on the edge of old wounds. He looked at her, finally, fully. And when he spoke, it was with a steadiness that felt older than the desert, older than men like her father and the peddler and every other voice that had ever tried to cage her. I want you to rest, he said. If that's what you need. Something broke inside her. Not violently. Not loud. Like ice thawing under the first touch of spring. She didn't answer. But when he offered his hand, she didn't flinch. She didn't take it, either. She stood on her own, shaky but upright, and followed him toward the horse. They rode slow. She sat behind him, hands gripping the back of the saddle, not him. He didn't reach for her once. The moon climbed high. The rope around her waist loosened with the motion of the horse. She untied it herself. And let it fall. In the darkness behind them, it curled like a snake shedding its skin, a thing no longer needed. They reached the valley just as the morning began peeling light across the hills, soft and golden like butter melting on bread. Mist clung low to the grass, threading between wild sage and early crocus flowers, and the land felt untouched by cruelty, like the kind of place where sorrow went quiet. The cabin stood near the edge of a creek that whispered over smooth stones. It wasn't large, but it held the shape of something lived in and tended. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line, and chickens wandered near the porch, pecking at the earth like they had secrets to keep. He dismounted first and reached for her, not to lift but to steady. She slid down on her own, her feet sore and her body stiff from the long ride. Her dress clung damp to her back, dust woven into every seam. She didn't ask what this place was. She simply looked. From the doorway, a little girl appeared. Maybe 8. Pale hair braided down her back, eyes too wide for her small face. She didn't shout or smile or run. Just stared, curious and calm. A smooth pebble sat in her palm, which she held out like an offering. The woman took it with trembling fingers. It was warm from the girl's hand. For protection, the child said, solemn as a preacher. The woman blinked. Then, unexpectedly, without planning, she laughed. Just a small breath of surprise. It felt strange in her throat, like a forgotten song humming back to life. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried thyme. The man moved with quiet purpose, setting about to make coffee, stoking the hearth. She stood near the door, unsure whether to step in or step back out. Her fingers gripped the edge of her sleeve, twisting fabric like rope. He didn't push her. Just nodded to a stool beside the fire. You warm enough? He asked. She nodded, though her skin felt numb and her thoughts fluttered like moths in her chest. The girl disappeared into a side room. A minute later, she returned with a blanket folded in both arms, dragging the corner on the floor. She handed it up with the seriousness of a soldier. Again, the woman said nothing. But she wrapped it around her shoulders, holding it there like it might fall if she let go. Later, they sat at the small table. Bread, beans, coffee. The kind of meal that filled the body but didn't crowd it. The man said little. She said less. But the silence wasn't the same kind she'd known before. It didn't suffocate. It made room. Over the next days, she learned the rhythm of the place. He rose early. Fed the animals. Chopped wood. Checked the traps. His movements were steady, unhurried. The girl followed him often, asking too many questions, forgetting her shoes. The woman stayed mostly indoors at first. She swept, out of habit. Folded what was already folded. She cleaned the windows one morning without realizing it, then stood staring out as if surprised by her own hands. No one told her to do these things. No one expected her to. She just didn't know how to sit still yet. One afternoon, while the man carved a length of cedar on the porch, the girl tugged at the woman's sleeve. "Can you sing?" The woman looked down, startled. "My mama used to sing to me," the child added, as if explaining an ancient rule. "But I forget the songs." It took a moment. Then another. But slowly, the woman found one. A tune half remembered from her own childhood. Low, lilting, carried by memory more than melody. She sang softly, voice dry with rust, but the girl leaned into it like a cat into sun. By nightfall, the tune lingered in the cabin walls. They didn't ask about her past. Not once. But in her dreams, the old voices still shouted. Her father's sneer. The peddler's hand. The silence of the crowd. She'd wake sometimes with clenched fists, breath caught in her throat like a sob that had nowhere to go. Once, he heard her. Didn't speak. Just set a glass of water near her bed and left the door cracked, the hallway lamp burning low. The days grew warmer. Wildflowers began dotting the valley, purple and yellow bursts against green. She spent one morning gathering some, not for a vase but for the soil outside the porch. She dug with her bare hands, fingers dirt-streaked, arms strong again. Not from work, but from life stirring underneath. Later, he noticed. "You planting something?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. She looked up. Her eyes met his for longer than a second. "Trying," she said. He nodded like that made all the sense in the world. That evening, as the girl dozed beside the hearth, the woman stood at the window. The valley stretched quiet outside. Stars pricked the sky, and the sound of frogs drifted in from the creek. He came to stand beside her, not close, not far. "I carved something," he said. She turned. He held out a small wooden figure, a horse, no bigger than her palm. Smooth lines, polished edges. A creature caught mid-run. She stared. "For what I think you carry," he said softly. "Something fast. Strong. Still wild." Her throat tightened. She reached for it. It was heavier than it looked. That night, she sat on her bed turning it in her hands. The figure smelled of cedar and oil, of care. She held it to her chest for a long time before laying it on the table beside her. She didn't sleep right away. But when sleep came, it stayed. And the next morning, when the sun touched the wildflowers by the porch, she stepped outside not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. She didn't know it yet, but she was beginning. Beginning to live like she was worth something. Beginning to believe she could stay. The wind had changed. It came now in restless bursts, stirring leaves from the cottonwood, pushing at the laundry she'd pinned along the porch rail. The sky had taken on a brittle blue, the kind that whispered of dry storms and something waiting just past the hills. The woman felt it in her spine, like a memory she hadn't asked for was on its way back to find her. She stood outside with her sleeves rolled up, hands dusted in flour from the morning's kneading. Inside the cabin, the little girl was humming softly as she tried to teach her doll how to tie a shoe. The widower was chopping wood near the barn, each strike of the axe clean, steady. He never worked with violence. Even his strength had patience. The woman wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the ridge. Nothing yet. But something was coming. By afternoon, it came into view, 3 men on horseback. She saw the middle rider first, the way he leaned back in the saddle, arrogant and loose, like the world owed him shade. Her body went still before her mind caught up. Her father. Closer now, and there was no mistaking him. The same cracked hat. The same sunburnt sneer. The same smell of whiskey, she imagined, baked into his clothes. 2 other men flanked him, brothers, or maybe just men who shared the same hollow behind their eyes. The child peeked from the doorway, then ran to fetch the widower without being told. The woman didn't move. She stood on the porch with her arms folded, not as defense, but as anchor. Her heart beat slow and deliberate, like footsteps on hard ground. Her father pulled his horse to a stop just below the steps. He didn't dismount. Just looked her over, head to toe, like inventory returned from a failed sale. "Well, I'll be," he drawled. "Didn't expect you to land yourself in silk after $4. Thought maybe you'd die in a ditch, or marry a bottle." She didn't answer. He looked past her, into the house. "That your brat inside? Don't tell me he laid with you already. Man must be hungrier than I thought." The words didn't sting. Not the way they used to. They landed like pebbles on steel. The widower stepped forward from the side of the house, wiping his hands with a rag. His jaw was set. His voice low and even. "She's here because she wants to be. And I don't recall asking your opinion." The father laughed, but it didn't carry far. The wind stole it before it could settle. She's mine, he said, spitting to the side. You think a man don't own what he feeds for 25 years? I sold her fair. And she ran. That means she's stolen goods. She ain't a sack of grain, the widower replied. You didn't sell her. You discarded her. And I picked up what you couldn't see was whole. The two other men shifted, uncertain whether this was a fight worth sticking around for. The woman stepped down from the porch. Her father turned to her, face twisted in mock sympathy. You think you're something now? You got one man to look at you like you weren't a burden, and you think that makes you special? Her hands were at her sides. She didn't clench them. Didn't raise her voice. I don't think I'm special, she said. I think I'm free. He laughed again, but it cracked halfway through. You're still mine. No matter how you dress it up. She shook her head. I was never yours. You kept me like a debt you didn't want to pay. And I carried your shame so long I almost believed it was mine. Silence stretched wide. I ain't ashamed, he muttered. She looked him in the eye. I know. That's the shame. One of the men beside him shifted in the saddle. She ain't worth this, he muttered. The father didn't respond. Just stared, something ugly curling behind his eyes. Then, without warning, he spat at her feet. You'll come crawling back, he snapped. Men like him, they always change their minds once they realize what they've got. He turned his horse sharply, and the others followed. They rode off without another word. Dust swirled behind them, catching in the folds of her dress, in the corners of her eyes. She didn't wipe it away. She just stood there until the sound of hoofbeats faded and the valley quieted again. The widower came to her side. Said nothing. Inside, the child was standing at the door, her eyes wide with confusion. The woman knelt and opened her arms. The girl ran into them, small hands clinging to her apron. That night, she dug a small hole near the wildflowers she'd planted. From her pocket, she drew 4 silver coins. Worn smooth now, edges dulled by time. She set them gently in the earth and covered them with soil. She didn't mark the grave. She didn't need to. It was enough to know they were buried. Later, by the fire, the widower sat across from her. The cabin was quiet but not tense. The child had fallen asleep with her doll still in hand, curled like a cat against the wall. You sure you're all right? He asked. She looked at him, not through him, not past him, but at him. I've never been more sure of anything. He nodded. They didn't speak for a long time after that. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the wind passed through the trees with a gentler hand. She watched the flames dance in the hearth and thought about roots, how they grow deeper in silence, how they don't bloom until they're ready. She wasn't blooming yet. But she'd stopped hiding from the sun. Winter came slower in the valley than in the towns east of the ridge. It arrived like a tired traveler, brushing frost on windows before dawn, curling smoke in longer threads from chimney tops. The creek thinned and stiffened, wildflowers gave way to brittle stems, and the chickens huddled close in the coop, feathers fluffed like shawls. Inside the cabin, warmth lived in more than the fire. It was in the rhythm of bread rising, of soft footsteps on old boards, of a child's laughter spilling over a quiet table. The woman no longer moved like someone unsure of her place. Her steps had settled. Her voice had steadied. She didn't look away when spoken to, and she didn't lower her head when she laughed. The widower watched her, not like a man waiting for gratitude, but like someone witnessing something rare, like watching a tree bloom in late autumn, stubborn and full of color. He never told her what to do. Never asked where she'd been. Instead, he made space. And every day, she filled a little more of it. The child had started calling her mama one day without warning. It slipped out like a breath, like a thing her heart had always known but her tongue hadn't dared speak. The woman froze at first, unsure if she had the right to answer. Then she smiled and pulled the girl close. Yes, she whispered. Just yes. One evening, while the sky yawned pale and the scent of cedar smoke curled through the cabin, the widower handed her a small wooden horse. Not the one he'd carved before, this one was different. Smaller, smoother, with her name burned gently into the side. She turned it over in her hands, eyes blinking with something warm and dangerous. I thought maybe, he said, his voice slow as creek water, you might want it for the days that try to pull you backward. She nodded, unable to speak. In the months that followed, she began sewing again. At first, just small things, a torn hem, a worn curtain. Then dresses. She made one for the girl, light blue with buttons shaped like flowers. When the child spun in it, the woman cried, though she told no one. Sometimes she still dreamed of her father. Of the look in his eyes that day on the porch. But the dreams no longer held her hostage. They came like old debts, remembered but unpaid. She'd wake, take a breath, and know she was still here. Still safe. Still whole. One morning, word reached them that the town was holding a harvest gathering, music, food, dancing. She hadn't been back since the day she stood in the street with a price tag around her neck. She didn't want to go. But the girl begged, eyes bright. Said she'd never danced outside before. The widower didn't push. Just said gently, "You don't know that place anything. But maybe it's time it owes you." So she went. She wore the dress she'd sewn herself, dark green with sleeves like folded leaves. Her hair was brushed smooth, braided down her back, tied with a ribbon the child had picked. Her hands trembled as they loaded the wagon. When they arrived, the townsfolk turned to stare. Conversation paused, eyes tracked her from under hats and behind handkerchiefs. She saw faces she remembered, faces that had laughed or looked away. For a moment, shame flared in her belly. But then the girl ran ahead, waving, and the crowd's attention scattered like dust. She walked beside the widower, not clinging, not hiding. Her shoulders were square. Her steps were even. A young woman from the bakery offered her a sweet roll. A boy complimented her dress. An older man tipped his hat and said it was good to see her again. And slowly, the noise returned. The music started, a fiddle, a banjo, boots tapping on wood. The girl grabbed the widower's hand, begged for a dance. He obliged, laughing, clumsy in the sweetest way. The woman stood at the edge, arms folded, unsure if she belonged. That's when someone touched her shoulder. "May I?" the widower asked, offering a hand, eyes soft. She hesitated. Then, she took it. They danced. Slowly at first, uncertain, like two people learning to breathe in time. Then easier, smoother, as the world softened around them. People watched. Some whispered. Most just smiled. And in that moment, she felt the thing she had never known she was missing, ease. When the music ended, she stepped away and looked to the edge of the square. Her father wasn't there. She didn't know if he ever would be again. And it didn't matter. Because she didn't need him to see her. She saw herself. Later that night, back at the cabin, they sat by the hearth while the girl slept curled on a quilt. The widower turned to her. "I've been thinking," he said, rubbing his thumb along the grain of the wood. "About this life. About what's missing." She looked at him, uncertain. "I'd like to build something more permanent," he continued. "But only if you'd want that. I don't mean because you owe me anything. I like who I am when you're near." She said nothing for a long while. Then she reached across the space between them, took his hand, and placed the small carved horse into it. "I'd like that too," she said. "But only if I can build it with you." Outside, the first snow began to fall, silent, soft, slow as forgiveness. Inside, the fire burned steady, golden alive. And on the mantel above it, he'd hung a sign just days before. Carved into cedar, plain and simple, it read, "Worth more than gold." She saw it every night now. And every time, it felt truer. Not because of who had written it. But because she finally believed it.